Linda and welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk about validation versus approval. And what I like to do in the video is first give you my definition of each of those terms and then give you a little bit more of an elaborate explanation, maybe with an example of how they present themselves in the real world, and then talk about why it is important to learn to differentiate between them, or why it is important for all of it, for you and for myself, to learn to differentiate between them. So first, let's start with my definition of both of these terms. And what I would say is that my definition of approval, and let's start there because that's the simplest one, is probably the same as most of you. So approval is just agreement, right? Implicitly or explicitly agreeing with someone else's thoughts, behaviors, perspectives, emotions, etc. Validation gets a little trickier, and they are often intertwined and they are often confused. People actually use the terms interchangeably, but they really are two very different things. Validation is the understanding and or acknowledgement of someone else's experience. And there's a little caveat to that because validation can also be applied to the self. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to focus on the interactions with other people just because it's easier to conceptualize. Now, going back to the definition of validation, is the understanding or acknowledgement of someone else's experience, of someone else's feelings, thoughts, etc. And the reason why it's important is to understand the difference is because validating someone's experience, saying, I understand why you feel that way, or I understand why you behave that way, doesn't actually mean that you agree with the behavior. They are, in fact, two very separate things. And it is very hard for people sometimes to understand that. And I would like to give an example that hopefully will make it a little bit clearer. So let's take the example of little Johnny and little Pete. They're two little boys. They are brothers, and they're both playing on the floor in the living room, and mom is sitting on the couch watching them play. So let's say little Johnny is the older brother, and he's playing with a truck, and little Pete, who's the younger brother, wants to play with the truck. And then mom says to Johnny, hey, Johnny, you've been playing with the truck for over an hour now and your little brother wants to play too, so why don't you give the truck to your brother? And Johnny says, no, I want to keep playing with the truck. And mom says, well, you've been playing with it for a while. I think your little brother would like to play with it. And he gets angry and throws the truck at his little brother and hits him. Okay, so it's a bit of a violent example, but it's actually a very good example, I think, hopefully, to explain to you what the difference is. So what most parents, and please understand, I am not a parent myself, but what I see, but I was a child, and I also have seen plenty of parents interact with their kids, and this is something that is very common, right? That scenario of like two little siblings fighting over or arguing over a toy. So what happens in that type of scenario is mom would come in and would maybe yell or reprimand or punish little Johnny, the older sibling, for throwing the truck. But normally what a parent or what mom in that situation would say is, hey, you shouldn't be angry. There's no reason for you to be angry. There's no reason for you to hurt your brother, blah, 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 right? So that is normally what I've seen in most interactions in my experience, and what I see, I think what is mostly represented across the board. The issue with that situation, and please understand I'm not giving any parenting advice here, but I'm using that as a very simple example of trying to explain what the difference is. In that scenario, the parent is mixing validation and approval. Because as I said at the beginning, validation is the understanding or acknowledgement of someone's experience. So versus approval, which is agreement with their experience, behavior, etc. So I'm going to change that example a little bit to hopefully give you a little bit more insight of what the difference is. So instead of reprimanding little Johnny and mom saying, hey, you shouldn't be feeling angry because you played with the truck already for over an hour and your little brother wanted it and that's naughty or that's not nice and what have you, if mom came over and said, hey, what you just did there was naughty. I understand that you're angry and I understand why you feel angry because you wanted to keep playing with the toy. However, hurting your little brother is not nice, it is naughty, and you're gonna go on a timeout for throwing the truck at your little brother. So the difference there is that mom is coming, or whichever parent is coming in and validating that the little boy feels angry and why he feels angry, because he still wants to continue playing with the toy, and separating that from the behavior and saying, I understand that you feel that way, and how you reacted to how your emotions is not correct, or is not right, or is naughty, or however you want to phrase it. So I think part of the trick of validation, in my perspective, is learning to differentiate between those things, between understanding someone's experience, someone's feeling, someone's emotions, someone's expression versus approval. And what I find is that a lot of times when those two things get mixed up, so in the first example where the little boys, where Johnny's experience or feelings were completely invalidated, normally the message that that sends to a child, or actually also to adults, but it starts in childhood. So that the message that that is sending is that your emotions are wrong, or that you shouldn't feel in a particular way. You shouldn't feel angry, or you shouldn't feel hurt, or you shouldn't feel this, that, or the other. So moving into why I think is so important for us to understand the difference between approval and validation is because normally when we are not validating, because we are disapproving of the behavior or the thought, the whatever, or the opinion, when we invalidate the emotions, we're actually sending the message that that feeling, or that, excuse me, that the emotions that you are feeling are not right, or are incorrect, or that we should not be having those emotions or expressing those emotions. When the message that I believe should be sent, not only to children, but actually to most adults that I encounter in my day-to-day life, myself included, is that the emotion is okay. The emotion is valid. The expression of that emotion is valid, is normal, is perfectly human. What it may or may not be great or correct or for the highest and best is how you choose to behave in reaction to that emotion or that experience. So it is really, really important to learn to separate those two things, so that when you are talking to someone whom you strongly disagree with, you can actually understand their perspective, or at least acknowledge what their perspective is, even if you disagree with what they're saying, or their opinion, or their thoughts, or their behaviors. And that's really apropos nowadays for the world that we're living in, right? So I'm recording this in 2019, July 2019, and in the U.S. and the state of politics in this country is incredibly divisive. Certainly, probably the most divisive that I've experienced in my lifetime. And I think one of the issues that I find when people of different political ideology or political parties or what have you encounter is that in order for them to, we continuously tie in the approval with validation that is, and I'm including myself in this, is very hard for me when I have someone with different ideology to say, I can understand why you feel that way, and I disagree for such and such reasons. But that's the reason, one of the reasons that I think understanding the difference and trying to practice this separation in our life, or this differentiation, discernment in our lives, is so important, is because it will help us connect with people better, even if those people have a completely different opinion or behaviors or reactions than we do or we would. The one thing that I also wanted to mention that I didn't mention earlier in the beginning is that what is really, really important also is that this validation, so this understanding of someone else's experience or perspective, this acknowledgement of their experience and perspective is genuine, right? So when we are having this exchange, this interaction with another person, we want that that desire, that our desire to understand or our desire to validate them to be completely genuine. And that is something that I myself struggle with on a pretty regular basis, particularly when it comes to political ideology or social ideology. So one of the tricks that I found that is helpful to me, is that because I want to be genuine, because authenticity is one of the most important things to me, normally when I'm having a hard time understanding, because remember, as we said at the beginning, validation requires an understanding, or at the very least an acknowledgement of another person's perspective. But sometimes that's very hard to do. Sometimes when you are when you're talking to someone and they're telling you about what their internal experience is, you cannot relate to that because you have no frame of reference to understand where they're coming from, because whatever, you grew up in different countries, different cultures, different religions, whatever the case may be. Now, one of the things that I found that is very helpful to me is that in those situations where I feel that I'm having a hard time understanding this other person's internal experience or acknowledging it because it's just something that I have no frame of reference for, what has helped me is asking questions. So generally, I'm a very curious person by nature, so that actually is very easy for me. So normally if someone is expressing their internal experience and I can't relate to them, I say, I really don't have any frame of reference for what you're talking about, and I really don't understand where you're coming from. Can you explain to me, can you elaborate a little bit more on that, or can you explain to me where does that come from, or why are you having those emotions, or why are you having that thought process? So while that is not necessarily the strict definition of validation, I believe, in my experience, it accomplishes the same, or at least a very similar goal, which is sending the signal to that other person that you're actually genuinely interested in who they are and where they're coming from. And I think that is something that can really change the discourse, not just in our country, in the US as a whole. And for those of you who are watching this and are not from the US, I imagine that you've been watching the news and know the situation that we are seeing here. And I think it's also happening across the world, but I digress. In any case, I think it's very important to express that curiosity, and to genuinely say to that person, hey, I would like to understand where you're coming from a little bit better. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to agree with that person or that you're going to be approving of their behaviors, thoughts, opinions, what have you, but it does give you a point of connection with that person that can actually help the discussion be a little bit more fruitful. So that's basically what the subject of this video today is. I would love to hear from you in the comments what your experience with validation versus approval is, if you have different definitions, if you've even ever heard about separating those two things. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and until next time, namaste.